Hey friends, it's Pastor Joe from Southwest Lutheran Church in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and this is our fifth and final video on abusive relationships. As we get started, first a safety reminder, please make sure you're in a safe place as you're watching this video, and if you're ever concerned for your own safety, please call 911, get emergency services help to make sure that you are physically safe. Our fifth video is about what can we all do to help stop abuse. Now, as I was preparing to talk about abusive relationships in our church, I read a really great book by a man named Lundy Bancroft, and the book is called Why Does He Do That? And in that book, he talks about how there's one thing that can reliably cause an abuser to stop their hurtful and destructive behavior. And that is when nobody will be their ally. When everybody around that person makes it very clear that disrespectful, coercive, manipulating, or intimidating behavior is absolutely unacceptable, that social pressure will cause an otherwise abusive person to dial it back and to stop doing that, those abusive behaviors, right? When they have no allies. And this is something we have to remember, that we talked about this already, but in an abuser's mind, they are very often, they feel like they're the victim. And they feel like they're the victim because they feel like their spouse is simply, or excuse me, their partner is simply not behaving the way that that partner is supposed to. And the abuser believes that although it is unfortunate, they simply have to exercise control over their partner. They feel like they are the victim because their partner is not doing everything that they want them to do. And so they believe they're justified in doing the things that they do. But when everybody around that abusive person makes it very clear that intimidating or disrespectful or abusive behavior is never appropriate, then that social pressure will cause an abuser to dial back their abuse, to make it less common. Abuse is very much a social dynamic, and that means that if we want to live in communities where there is hopefully none, but at least less abuse, then we can all pay attention to our own actions and the way we respond to abusive sorts of situations when we encounter them. Now, if you would ask a bunch of people, go take a poll on the street, and you would ask them, is it ever appropriate for one person to abuse their spouse, their fiance, their boyfriend or girlfriend? Or is it ever appropriate for someone to control their partner through, violence or intimidation or emotional manipulation? Those people are almost uniformly going to say no, because we know those things aren't right. And yet, it's very easy for people to become unwittingly an ally of an abuser. So, for example, how this can happen is if you might be the family or close friends of an abuser, it's very hard for us to believe that someone whom we are close to could be an abuser. And because abusive relationships look like, in many ways from the outside, they look like other troubled relationships, and that abuser always has a reason, always has a justification, right? They will always share their side of the story, and they'll convince everyone around them that they are the victim. And so it's easy for the family and friends of an abuser to unwittingly become an ally of that abuser and validate their feelings of victimhood. Or even the family and friends of the person who's being abused. One thing we have to remember is that people who abuse in relationships can very often be skilled manipulators. And they can even convince the family and friends of the person they're abusing that there's something wrong with their partner. There's something wrong with the person whom they know. And this is something that we have to understand. Abusers will always have excuses and justifications. And you simply cannot treat an abusive relationship the way that you would treat an ordinary troubled relationship, right? There's ordinary troubled relationships where people have problems connecting, where people have problems communicating. An abusive relationship is something else entirely, where it's not a failure of communication, but it's a moral choice that one person believes they have the right to control another. And so family and friends, if they of the person who's being abused, if they treat that abusive relationship like any other troubled relationship, and they say, hey, you've got to have compassion for that person. You've got to give them more time. Maybe you just need to go along a little more with what they want from you. Well, that's all playing right into the designs of the abuser. And so the family and friends of the person who's being abused can become unwitting allies of the abuser. And all of us in every situation, we should understand that there are powerful cultural attitudes which often normalize and enable abuse in our cultures. Things like jealousy or possessiveness in relationships or controlling behavior in relationships, we should understand is not okay. But sometimes we celebrate these things and say, look at how committed that person is to faithfulness or things like that, when in fact it's just jealousy or controlling behavior. We should not applaud those things. Sometimes we'll talk about the value of relationships in themselves and say, hey, isn't it worth it just to stick it out? Or we'll say, you made a commitment, you have to stick with it no matter what. But this also isn't appropriate in an abusive relationship. And we need to be able to say that people who are being abused never owe it to the abuser to continue trying to live in the abusive relationship. They never owe it to the abuser to keep quiet or to endure the abuse for the sake of, the relationship, for the sake of the image of themselves or the abuser or others, right? We should never, ever tell someone who is being abused that they owe it to the abuser or to anyone else to stay in that relationship. Sometimes, too, this is another form of valuing the relationship over the people in the relationship. We'll say, hey, don't children need two parents? As if that's a reason to remain in an abusive relationship. And, well, yeah, it's true that it's always best for children to have two loving parents. But what children need more than two parents is two loving parents. And if you can't have two loving parents, it's much better to have one parent who's free from abuse than it is to be in an abusive and controlling environment, right? It's better for that child to be out of the abusive environment than it is for them to have two parents in an abusive environment, right? That's just true. So, what does this mean? Well, it means that the reality of abusive relationships is something that we all need to deal with together. You can imagine if we as a culture would just simply insist that every person needs to be respected, and if we would simply insist that coercion is never okay, and if we would simply insist that violence and manipulation and intimidation has no place in our relationships, abusers would not feel safe in abusing their partners. And we should want abusive relationships to end. We should not want them in our community, in our congregations, in our society as a whole. So what can we do toward that end? Well, here's a few things you can do. One is, when you see it, just simply don't tolerate disrespectful behavior. If you see someone who's acting disrespectfully toward another, no matter who that may be, whether it's the cashier at the grocery store or their spouse, just don't let it be okay. If it's safe, mention it. It's not okay to treat people like that. Don't tolerate disrespectful behavior. Another way, and this is kind of an insidious way that we dehumanize people, but don't tolerate crude or disrespectful humor, right? We often tell disrespectful jokes about people. We can have fun and be funny without being disrespectful. And when we tolerate crude and disrespectful humor toward others, well, what we're doing is we're dehumanizing the target of those jokes. And so simply don't tolerate it. And if we insist that we must respect people even in our humor, well, that leads to greater respect for others overall and less coercive behavior. A third thing you can do, and that's kind of the point of this whole series of videos, is to be aware of the reality of abusive relationships. Back in the very first video we shared, the U.S. CDC reports 1/3 of women in the U.S. either are or have lived in an abusive environment. And 1/4 of men either are living or have lived in an abusive relationship. And that's probably underreporting the numbers, right? So be aware of the reality. Something else you can do is that If someone comes to you with a report of abuse, or says they're living in an abusive relationship, or they tell you that their spouse, their partner, their boyfriend or girlfriend, their fiance has done something violent, coercive, intimidating, believe them, right? When someone comes to you with a report of abuse, believe them. Sometimes we get concerned that we're gonna, drag someone's good name through the mud if we believe a report of abuse or violence and then later it turns out to be not true. But the truth is that very, very rarely do false reports happen. And what's more often the case is the person who reports that abuse has had to go through an awful lot and overcome a lot of their own feelings of guilt and shame to even mention it to someone. So if someone comes to you with a report of abuse, believe them. Remember, it's not your job to sort out whether it's true or false. It's your job then to try to help them get to resources that can help them take the next steps. And it's someone else's job to figure out whether it's true or false, right? That's the job later on of courts or other things. But if someone comes to you with a report of abuse, believe them. If you personally witness something disrespectful or potentially intimidating or potentially abusive, right? Don't ignore it, right? If you see disrespectful behavior, controlling behavior, or violent behavior in public, don't ignore it. And if you can do it safely, let the person who's doing it, let them know that you disapprove. Just say, hey, it's not okay to treat your girlfriend or your boyfriend like that. It's not okay to act that way towards people. Again, if you can do it safely, that's a good thing to do. And if you see that sort of thing, and you can do it safely and especially confidentially, you can reach out to the person whom you saw who was the recipient of that abuse. Especially if you saw them, it's like two partners, right? A husband and wife or something like that, You can reach out to that person individually, privately, confidentially, and just let them know, right? Abusive behavior isn't right, and it also isn't their fault. It's always the responsibility of the abuser. So you can reach out to that person just to let them know that you're a safe person and to encourage them and even to point them to other resources. And I will say, if you see a situation or an environment that looks abusive and you aren't sure what to do about it, you can talk to me. If I know you, you can talk to me and I would be happy to talk with you confidentially about what you've seen, about any situation you've witnessed, and to share resources and possible next steps for what you can do next. So I want to wrap this whole series up by reminding us once again, we've been saying this over and over, it's all about Jesus, right? Because Jesus died on the cross and he rose again to make us new. He died on the cross and rose again so that none of us should have to bear the burden of guilt and shame in our lives. And this area of intimate relationships, marriages, boyfriend, girlfriend, dating relationships, people who are engaged, people whom we love and people with whom we're close. This is one area where Christians can and should lead the way in encouraging relationships of respect and mutuality between spouses and between all people. So, hey, that's it. I hope this has helped you. Talking about these things in our congregation has been a blessing for all of us here at Southwest. If you got more questions, please feel free to reach out. Take care and God bless.